All right, everybody. Welcome to the Rowan College of Burlington County, hereafter referred to by our acronym RCBC Global Studies Lecture Series, continuation, a series of conversations that started last year in fall 2020 and continues today in global health, environment, and security and key international issues affecting those. This event and this series is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education Undergraduate and Undergraduate International Studies and Foreign Language Grant Program, a multi-year grant with us, RCBC, and our partner institution, Rowan University, and to build global and international studies at both institutions, and also courses in high-demand languages such as Arabic and Chinese, along with students' activities reflecting those initiatives, including this series. This event is also hosted by RCBC, a mid-sized community college in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, serving the geographically largest county in the state with anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 students each semester. RCBC has one of the most ethnically diverse student bodies in the state and region, with one of the lowest tuition costs as well. We offer a diverse array of degree and certificate programs across numerous academic and workforce-focused disciplines. Many students of ours stay for a third year in our innovative 3+1 programs, whereby students can earn a 4-year degree at highly reduced cost. And this is hopefully an appropriate host institution for such a series on international issues, as RCBC has one of the most diverse student bodies based on major demographic characteristics such as ethnic background and country of origin of students. I'm your host for this event and this series. I'm Brandon Chapman, instructor and department chair of anthropology and sociology at the college, and also the director of the previously mentioned grant and our budding global studies initiatives. The goal of this lecture series is to bring to our college campus, and here today our virtual WebEx campus, top-level scholars, academics, researchers, and industry professionals at all levels of career, early, mid, and late career, that are experienced, knowledgeable experts in global health, environment, and security issues, and to develop this knowledge and skills in our students at both RCBC and Rowan University, and to have a dynamic conversation about key global issues within these areas, and to give our students such avenues to advance their training in these topics. Look for more of these events in the future, with multiple speakers coming this semester, fall of 21. We already have scheduled just in a couple weeks from now, September 30th. This will also be these events on the RCBC event calendar on the website. We'll be having a discussion about global climate change and environmental policy and how these affect security issues in various regions of the world and also globally. October 15th, just 2 weeks after that, we'll have the renowned Soviet and global historian Stephen Kotkin from Princeton and Stanford University's Hoover Institution, talking with us about global megatrends in geopolitics and the economy. And then we also have, we are looking to get another renowned speaker in November. That's going to hopefully be a good extension on these topics on U.S. China relations in November later in the year. So we've got multiple events coming up to look forward to, and then also at least one and possibly multiple events in this series in spring 22 as well. So we've got a good schedule coming up over the coming academic year. This afternoon, I should say, we have the pleasure of welcoming 3 guest speakers for a colloquium style event. I'll introduce them alphabetical by last name. First, we have Dr. Alica Ba, who was able to join us here at the last minute. So hello, Dr. Ba. She is a professor of political science and international relations at the University of Delaware in Newark, Delaware. She's been there for over 2 decades now, and she has multiple research areas of expertise and interest, including international relations of Southeast Asia, with special focus on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, regional cooperation in Southeast Asia, and also power relations and geopolitics there, and also relations between China and the United States. Some of her current projects include looking at institutional dimensions of regional order, security in the Malacca Strait, and also approaches to great power and grand strategy and conflict in Southeast Asia. She's authored multiple books and volumes, including Renegotiating East and Southeast Asia, Regionalism, and the Association of Southeast Asia Nations. She teaches multiple courses in Southeast Asia development, Chinese foreign policy, and regionalism in Southeast Asia. So let's welcome Dr. Ba to our talk. Next, we have Dr. Hyun-Binn Cho. Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Studies at the College of New Jersey in Ewing, next to Trenton, New Jersey. Dr. Cho has multiple affiliations currently, including he's an associate with the project on managing the atom at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. He has multiple previous affiliations as well as a pre- and postdoctoral fellow at places such as George Washington University, Stanford University, and also the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy, associated with the Harvard Kennedy School. He's conducted field research in China, India, and South Korea, so East Asia and South Asia. And current research interests and research areas include crisis escalation, coercive diplomacy, and nuclear security with a regional focus on China and the Korean Peninsula. And finally, we have Dr. Xian Huang, Department of Political Science Assistant Professor there at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, the main campus. She has multiple affiliations currently as well. She is a affiliated faculty member at Rutgers in the Center for Chinese Studies, and also an associate in the China Center for Social Policy at Columbia University. Columbia is where she also did her doctorate. She has, as some of our previous guests, numerous postdoctoral fellow and fellowships as well, previous in her career, with the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University as well. She did her undergraduate and some of her graduate work at Peking University in Beijing, China. She teaches various undergraduate and graduate courses on authoritarian politics, comparative political economy of East Asia, and Chinese politics. And her research interests and expertise look at and focus on China and East Asia, a lot of social policy, including things like political causes and consequences of inequality and stratification, health policy, health care, and public opinion and preferences under authoritarian rule. Just a note here on agenda and format for the event. We will have each of our guests speak for about 10 minutes or so as opening remarks to sort of set the stage. And unless our guests they have any objection to this, I suppose we can go in order. So we'll have Dr. Ba, Dr. Cho, and Dr. Huang in that order, I believe. And then we can do a series of questions to have a discussion after that. I think given the size of audience we have and the dynamic comments that our guests are going to give us, we can do multiple things perhaps with the discussion. I would encourage your audience to submit questions in the chat message board. If any of you want to use audio, you can also raise your hand at that time after our opening remarks to give questions and provide questions to our guests. I've also, in case there aren't many questions, I've pre-authored some questions as the moderator and host as potential to give as well, and maybe combined with some of your all's questions. And of course, our guests, our three guests, I highly encourage you all to interact with each other as well, of course, especially after our opening remarks. And given all of that, we should be able to have a fairly positive and dynamic discussion here on these important issues. So with that, with the talk here and the discussion titled China's Role in Global and East Asia Regional Security, let's welcome Drs. Ba, Dr. Cho, and Dr. Huang to Rowan College at Burlington County. And with that, Dr. Ba, let me make sure you are a presenter here as well, and I will give the floor over to you to start.
So thank you very much. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'm glad to finally get on and join the conversation. Since I'm starting, I did think it would be useful to start with a map because maps are useful, not just because it helps to situate China, but also because I think that too often we talk about China in abstractions without really appreciating where it's situated. And of course, positionality and location are critical starting points for thinking about regional strategy and regional security. Given time, I'm actually going to focus my remarks on Southeast Asia. And one way to kind of think about Southeast Asia then is that it is one of these neighborhoods, several neighborhoods that surround China, right? We can talk about Central Asia, South Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia is really constituted by two subregions. Southeast Asia geographically has importance to China as strategic and commercial sea lanes. It gets critical goods to markets, energy resources to China. And Southeast Asia's location also gives it greater location importance because it is also the connecting link between land and sea, and also between the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, right? And so when you get a chance to take a look at the map, you'll be able to see how it connects, right? Southeast Asia is also economically important to China because of robust border trade. Southeast Asia as a whole is also now ranked as China's top trading partner. And so for both geographic, economic, and strategic reasons, Southeast Asia is an important periphery region to Southeast Asia and arguably more important than some others, right? One of the challenges for China and Southeast Asia, or really in any of its periphery regions, is that China's relations with these regions do not exist in isolation. Right? It doesn't exist in isolation from its relations with larger powers. In Central Asia, we have Russia. In South Asia, we have India. And of course, in Northeast and maritime Southeast Asia, the most important major power of concern is the United States, which plays an outsized role, especially in maritime Southeast Asia. The United States is large enough, in fact, that and prominent enough, given its bases, its logistical facilities, and other arrangements with different states in Southeast Asia, that some would also list the United States as part of China's East and Southeast Asian neighborhoods, right? And what this means is that what China does in East and Southeast Asia is going to be colored and conditioned by that U.S. presence, U.S. interests, and U.S. actions. The United States is an extremely influential actor in Southeast Asia as well as in Northeast Asia. And so again, China's policies, approaches, and relations with Southeast Asia will be significantly affected by the state of U.S. China relations. Right? And this has been the case since the advent of the Cold War. But as we're probably all aware, the U.S. China relationship today is increasingly fraught and tense, the worst since normalization. As a way to think about the layers of relationships and as a way to kind of think about how China's thinking about the region and approaching Southeast Asia, I think it's useful actually to go back to a characterization made by China's former president, Hu Jintao. And the way that he characterized it is that, quote, major powers are the key. Surrounding countries are the first priority. Developing countries are the foundation. And multilateral forums are the important stage. At each of those points, Southeast Asia is important. It is a region in which the United States, a major power, plays a major role. It is among China's surrounding countries, and it is also amongst world's developing countries, a critical audience for China's actions. And also, it is the site of significant multilateral activity and platforms, especially via the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. To return to the U.S. question in Asia, U.S. geopolitical insecurities have heightened the importance of Southeast Asia for China. To be clear, Southeast Asia has intrinsic value to China, but the U.S. role also very much affects the directions and priorities of China's Southeast Asia relations. We see the intersection again of major power politics and also periphery regional politics with China. And again, this is especially apparent at a time of deteriorating U.S.-China relations. We also see as a result some contradictory and contrary policies from China in Southeast Asia. Probably the most common and commonly cited contradiction is that represented by China's Belt and Road policies, infrastructure and development policies, and outreach to Southeast Asia on the one hand, and of course, things like the South China Sea on the other, in which China's stance is both zero-sum and at times strident, especially against claimants in Southeast Asia that take stronger stances in pushing back against China. So we can also think about China's contradictions as finding expression in terms of different views expressed about China in Southeast Asia. The one is that on the one hand, and here I'm citing an annual survey from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, on the one hand, Southeast Asian states, elites, identify China as the most powerful economic and strategic country in the region. On the other hand, anxieties about China's strategic influence have increased, right, over the years, right? And this is despite intensified and expanded engagement. And that's the contradiction in both China's policies, but also in terms of what China has to deal with when it is approaching Southeast Asia. The ongoing task then for China is how to stabilize that periphery in ways that do not detract from its security. Again, Southeast Asia is a critical periphery region. It is a buffer region. It is a region through which critical Chinese resources must traverse. China has several tools in its toolbox. I'm not going to go over all of them. I'm just going to simply mention some of them, and we can certainly talk about it later. I've already mentioned development initiatives. We can talk about partnerships, regional and multilateral frameworks. And again, China has taken greater initiative in recent years as well. Defense diplomacy, party-to-party diplomacy. Again, I won't get into all of them, but I want to mention them as a way to kind of think about the different ways in which China has been engaging Southeast Asian states. Before my time is up, let me just make a few other observations about recent developments. One, for China, and I would also argue for Southeast Asian states, the last 2 years have been dominated by two very immediate imperatives. One, managing COVID, and two, assuring economic growth. For China, there's also a third. Namely, I would argue to take advantage of the economic and diplomatic openings that were created by the Trump administration. Right? On each of those three goals, we thus see China's heightened diplomacy and engagement of Southeast Asia over the last 2 years. We see China's COVID diplomacy to Southeast Asia, right? China was an early supporter of the WHO's COVAX efforts. China provided early assistance in all kinds, actually, when we talk about COVID assistance. 29% of China's donated vaccines have gone to Southeast Asia. 26% of its commercial vaccines have gone to Southeast Asia. Right? So again, Southeast Asia is certainly an important priority when it comes to COVID assistance efforts. There are recent questions about Sinovac, as some of you may be aware. And though this is a setback for China, right, given, questions about its efficacy, especially against the Delta variant, it's also true that the availability of Chinese vaccines also remains higher than most, right? And so for many, this is still a vaccine that they're able to get, okay? We can also see China's outreach in terms of recent tours of Southeast Asia. Foreign Minister Wang Yi and others in fall of last year, the start of this year, last week, right, has made tours of Southeast Asia. Right? China has also invited all 10 Southeast Asian foreign ministers to China as well. So there's been quite active outreach on the part of China during this period. And in these exchanges, China has tried to speak to some of Southeast Asia's key concerns on the economy, on their concerns about regional platforms that they felt that the United States had neglected, and also responding to the concern that some have in Southeast Asia that the United States, especially under the Trump administration, was provoking conflict. Now, the advent of the Biden administration and its engagement of Southeast Asia, of course, creates difficulties in terms of China's outreach, because now the United States is, so to speak, trying to get back into the game, right? And so this will be an ongoing kind of challenge for China. But again, as we can see in recent efforts, China and its visit and tours of even including last week, we see China continuing to try to engage these different states. And economics, I think, will be one of the key pathways and strengths in terms of China's engagement. I'm going to leave it at that so that the other speakers can go and we can talk some more about any of these points.
Thank you, Alice. Gives us the sort of two sides, right? The two hands, if we can say. The one hand of the negotiative bodies, the development assistance from China, but then also the coronavirus help recently, but then also the aggressive with Belt and Road and these sort of dominance plays, if you will, geopolitically. So this gives us a great start to think about some of these issues. Thank you for the opening remarks. Dr. Cho, you want to go ahead?
All right. Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'm very excited to share my thoughts today on this very exciting panel. Let me just try and pull up my slides and see if they appear.
I'm sure you'll be luckier than me.
Maybe second time's the charm. We'll see. Can people see this?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, fortunately, I have some slides. Maybe and a map as well. So maybe I can try and help people picture some of these in their minds. Okay, so I'm going to spend around 11 minutes on the topic of China, United States, and security in the Asia-Pacific region. I've divided my remarks into roughly 3 segments, the first of which is geography, right? And in terms of geography, I'm actually going to pull up a map, which I think probably is going to be a little bit different from what Dr. Ba had planned to share, because my map looks like this. So it's kind of like it's kind of more zoomed out. So I'm not sure you can see my cursor, but you see China here. I refer to this as kind of the Asia-Pacific region, or at least it captures much of what I think as the Asia-Pacific region. I'm going to mention eventually why I think thinking about the Asia-Pacific is also very important, because various terms have been used to try and understand this region, such as Asia, East Asia, Northeast Asia, and such. Well, we can begin by thinking about China again, right? So we see that China is surrounded by multiple countries, including very powerful actors here, like Russia, right? So China shares a border here. China has many borders with these countries, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and such. You see Afghanistan and Pakistan also very close by. China shares a border with India, another very powerful country. And here you have the Southeast Asia region. You have Taiwan here. China also shares a border with North Korea. But in this Asia-Pacific region, we also see Australia and New Zealand, right, as well as the South China Sea here. So China is surrounded by very powerful, influential actors. Another reason why I like thinking about the Asia-Pacific is because across the Pacific Ocean, we have the United States, right? So in this map, you can see the North American continent begin to emerge here on the top right, right? Not only that, you can see that really this far out, you see U.S. territory, the Mariana Islands and even Guam, right? So it very much the United States has these interests very much in this Asia-Pacific region is what I would like to highlight in this map. Not only does the United States have these interests right up in this region, the United States also has a military presence. Again, this is what Dr. Ba was also touching upon as well. And this is one diagram that captures some of these. So we see Guam, Hawaii, South Korea, and Japan, for instance, and these include military bases as well as stationed troops. So the United States has these military assets in the region. From China's point of view, you can begin to imagine that it's already surrounded by very powerful and influential actors. But the United States also has assets very close by that are right around its coastal area when we think about the Asia-Pacific region. Switching back from the US to the US point of view again, some people have thought about this region in terms of these island chains. This is another concept that people have used. And if you think about this kind of area where you have Japan, Taiwan, and the South China Sea, some people have referred to this as including the first island chain. And the second blue line, which includes Guam as the second island chain. And very kind of bluntly speaking, we can kind of think about this as kind of lines of defense from the US point of view, for instance, right? So again, the geography here is very important. A question that arises, however, is, how much power does China have, or how much influence does it really have? And we can begin to think about power in many different ways, right? We can measure power in many different ways. But for instance, in terms of economic power, I think most of us understand that China's economy is only second to the United States in terms of its size. In terms of some economic indicators, for instance, purchasing power parity, China is sometimes seen as the largest economy. you think about per capita GDP or gross domestic product, China is far behind the United States, right? So the average individual in China is not as wealthy as the average individual in the United States, for instance, even though its economy is very large. Moving to the military sector, we begin to see that there is a larger kind of disparity in terms of Chinese power or Chinese military power and US power. And among the many indicators that we can use, one is US defense spending. Just to give you a kind of sense of what this looks like, I'm going to pull up this diagram from that's compiled in April 2001, so 2021, excuse me, so only a few months ago. The data is from CIPRI, which is a very influential think tank. It's compiled by the Peter Peterson Foundation. But basically, it shows us that the United States spends more on military defense than the next 11 countries combined. Right? So here we see an order of magnitude in difference between US military spending versus China here, which is larger than other countries, but still much smaller than the United States. And we can put together China, India, Russia, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, Italy, and Australia, and the United States still spends more on defense. So this is one indicator of how powerful US military power could be. Another indicator that people think about is nuclear weapons, right? So this is a diagram that shows us the estimated nuclear warhead inventories from 2001. And we can see several things. First of all, United States, 5,550. Russia, immediately, we notice that Russia has a little more, although my understanding is that most of these, a lot of these are actually held in reserve. But for us, right, we can focus on China here, which only has 350 or so nuclear weapons. And again, there's an order of magnitude difference between the number of nuclear weapons or nuclear warheads China has and the United States has, right? We can add a 0 to the end of China's number here, and still it will be smaller than the US inventory. So this is another indication of this power disparity in terms of military power between the United States and China. So I want to emphasize the fact that when it comes to military power, the United States is far more advanced than China in many dimensions. So we're all familiar with this narrative that China is rising in terms of influence and power, but how much power is enough to really have people more concerned about security in the region and on the global stage? A very influential argument that has been put forward by this professor at Columbia University, Professor Thomas Christensen, is that China can pose problems without catching up. And this is a very interesting point of view because it tells us that even though China may not match US power, military or economic power on the global stage, China still has formidable military capabilities within the region, and that these can present many different kind of challenges, right? So China has already modernized its forces. It has a very capable military force, especially when you think about how it might fight in the region. China also has geographic advantages near its borders, right? It's close by. And combined, in a potential conflict in the region, China could potentially impose significant costs on US forces, enough costs, in fact, to maybe have the United States be deterred or maybe even retreat in a conflict, right? And moreover, China has very strong national interests in this region. Thirdly, I want to talk about intentions. And what I mean by intentions is, what does China want, right? What is the end game here? So thinking about intentions, people have thought about this in different ways. Some people have turned, in fact, to Chinese actions in the South China Sea as one type of indicator of what China might want, right? So China has built artificial islands in the South China Sea. Just to pull up a picture to demonstrate what this looks like. This shows us that this on the far left here, you see this kind of coral reef type area in the sea, and China has built up these areas into an island. They have built, for instance, a helipad, right? And many of these artificial islands are being used or could potentially be used militarily, right? So experts have pointed out that this seems to indicate China has become much more interested in really perhaps becoming more assertive in the region, right? So maybe its growing military capabilities, its growing economic capabilities are being put to use to really kind of protect its interests more strongly than it has before. And some people are worried that this might even lead to some kind of expansionist mind from the Chinese. So some people have taken this as an indication that China wants to expand, that it wants to kind of grow and wield its power. These are ongoing debates, right? So I'm going to pull up just two very well-written research papers on these topics, right? On the left-hand side, you see these authors write about what China might think in terms of international order when it becomes more powerful. On the right-hand side, you see this author, Professor Avery Goldstein, write about China's grand strategy. Right? So what does Xi Jinping really want? How is he leading the country? And there are ongoing debates about what China wants. What I want to focus on, in addition to this discussion, is the fact that there's a large risk or significant risk of inadvertent crisis escalation. So it isn't always clear what China wants, right? There is this ongoing debate. Yet it does seem fairly clear that China doesn't want to get into a war with the United States, right? A conflict will be very costly for both sides. It will probably be very destructive as well, right? And even if this is a shared interest between China and the United States, there is the risk that even these small crises could inadvertently escalate into a larger conflict. For instance, clashes in the South China Sea might involve miscalculation, may involve misperceptions, emotions, nationalism, and these can kind of snowball into a larger conflict. I think this is something that people are spending kind of even more time on to try and figure out what the risks are and how this might escalate. And indeed, this is one of my own research interests. Okay, so just to summarize the few points that I've made today, in terms of geography, I just want to make clear that the United States is significantly involved in the Asia-Pacific region, geographically speaking as well, and that China has powerful neighbors and sometimes claims to feel surrounded by these powerful neighbors, and sometimes somewhat maybe insecure about that fact. In terms of power, China is very powerful, but not yet as powerful as the United States, yet China can pose problems in the Asia-Pacific region, even without catching up. In terms of intentions, what does China want? Right? This is an ongoing debate, but nevertheless, I think many people agree that China probably doesn't want to get into a war with the United States. But that being said, these small disputes can still escalate into a larger conflict because of these misunderstandings or misperceptions. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out even after the panel. But thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ben. You give us a lot to think about here very clearly, especially with the sometimes unclear intentions internationally of China. You bring that out very well in specifics. And it's also interesting you mentioned grand strategy. Actually, Avery Goldstein was the first in our series about this time last year from UPenn. So some of our students have had his perspective on this before. He talked about grand strategy. So that's maybe a topic we'll get into a little more in our discussion. We'll see how it goes. So thank you for the opening remarks. Dr. Huang, whenever you're ready, go next.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank Dr. Chapman for inviting me. This is a great opportunity to share my thoughts and also, more importantly, to hear the views of two great experts on this topic. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm gonna talk about the Chinese citizens' support for and also resistance to the current political regime. And I will try to draw some implication, discuss how the political support and resistance to the regime inform China's roles in regional and global security. In my remarks, I'm gonna make 5 points. First of all, Chinese citizens' support for the current political regime is quite high. This is like a general statement of my first point. Many national representative social survey data have reported that at least 3/4 of the respondents, they express high or very high support for the current government, for the central government, and majority of respondents support their local governments. So every 3 out of 4 respondents, they support the current political regime in China. Although the support rate in China also fluctuates over time, but it remains at a high level and quite strong if we compare it to that in other countries. Now I want to make a clarification here. In the Chinese context, the political regime is often fused with the Chinese Communist Party and the government. So the high level of regime support I just mentioned means that Chinese citizens are generally trusting and also satisfied with the party and the government. Given that people do not freely participate in politics, nor they have full political freedom or rights in China, it is puzzling to many Westerners why the Chinese support for the current regime is so high. Existing studies have identified a set of factors that are significantly associated with a high level of regime support in China. Just to name a few, economic development, nationalism, traditional or Confucian values, anti-corruption policy, expansion of various social welfare programs are all found associated with high level of regime support in China. That's my first point. And my second point is about the instrumental evaluation of regime support in China. In theory, there are 2 sources of regime support, political support. One is intrinsic values. People support a political regime because the ideology or the vision of the regime is consistent with or at least compatible with their political values. The other source of regime support is instrumental. People will reward the regime with high support if their well-being is improved by the regime. And research has found that among East Asian countries, the instrumental support for a political regime is more prevalent than the intrinsic support. And this is more so in authoritarian countries. Empirical study and evidence from China generally support this pattern identified in East Asia. The instrumental evaluation of regime support is particularly salient in China. And this suggests that the citizen support for the regime can be susceptible to the regime's manipulation or co-optation. And research found that expansion of welfare benefits and the upward social mobility engineered by the state has significantly effectively bolstered popular support for the central government or for the local government. So the prevailing view in the literature is that the Chinese authoritarian regime's legitimacy, which is used to be derived from the revolution, has gradually diminished. And the regime now is more and more relying on the performance legitimacy, that is to bring about improvements in people's well-being. That is my second point, the instrumental evaluation of regime support in China. And my next point is kind of like a natural question based on the previous 2 points. That is how sustainable it is. I mean, the performance legitimacy and the high level of regime support contingent on the good performance of the regime. We know that external factors such as economic crisis, the pandemics, change of international environment relations can substantially affect the regime's capacity to meet the citizens' increasing demands. So the performance legitimacy and the high level of regime support associated with such legitimacy can be vulnerable to external factors. They can be fragile. And besides external factors, internal or domestic factors derived from the Chinese political system can also shape the regime's capacity and success to maintain such high level of regime support. China's governance structure is multi-level. So under the central government, there are 4 levels of local government. They are province, city, county, and township government. And most government policies, with a few exceptions, are decentralized to the local government, and mainly the city and the county level government. So such a decentralized governance system in China profoundly shaped the policy making in two ways. First, the local government has much discretionary power in policy making and policy implementation. And second, the local government shoulder most of the financial responsibility burden of providing public goods and social services. So the decentralized feature of Chinese governance also generates large variation in most policy domains. Okay, so and besides decentralization, China's governance is also characterized as fragmented authoritarianism. The state dominates most policy making. However, the policy authority is often destroyed and shared among different government departments, agencies. So policy is often made out of competing, conflicting interests among those government bureaucracies, agencies, rather than out of an overarching set of principles. As a result, policy outcomes sometimes are suboptimal. They are less effective. That's my third point. Now I'm gonna talk about the popular resistance to the regime, because the high level of regime support in China shouldn't be interpreted as suggesting that public discontent or resentment of the regime do not exist in China. And the fact that the Chinese authoritarian regime often use co-optation to garner popular support doesn't mean that it doesn't use coercion, repression for the same purpose. In fact, labor, land, and welfare-related protests, petitions are widespread and common in China. It is estimated that up to 180,000 incidents of collective action taking place in China every year. The Chinese regime is very sensitive to the threat of collective action. But the prevailing view among China's scholars is that the domestic protests do not pose a credible threat to the regime yet. The Chinese regime is very adaptive and responsive in the face of widespread petitions, protests, and it has been quite successful, effective in mitigating the threats posed by popular contention through co-optation, repression, or information control. And I want to mention one interesting phenomenon established in the contentious politics literature called rightful resistance in China. That is, citizens, they engage in petitions, demonstration, based on established rule or deploy government policy, regulations, commitment in their claim making. So in this sense, the public resistance or their protests do not necessarily contradict the expressed regime support. Okay, their expressed support for the regime, and that most of those petitions or protests are carefully phrased in patriotic and legalistic language without questioning the legitimacy of the regime. So we see both high level of popular support and also widespread contentions, collective action, protests in China. At last, I want to conclude my remarks by returning to the theme of today's event, that is how the popular support or the resistance to the current regime in China inform China's roles in regional and global security. I think there are three implications. First and foremost, domestic political order and stability have been and will continue to be the regime's priority in policy making and resource allocation. And second, the regime's paramount interest of maintaining domestic stability order may be increasingly manifest in its instrumental use of foreign policy, overseas investment, leadership in regional organization, and involvement in international affairs. After all, domestic and international politics are inseparable. the Chinese regime's increasing assertiveness, ambitions in the international arena reflect and will also shape its popularity among its people. And third, the vulnerability of the Chinese regime's performance legitimacy and the regime's support contingent on the good performance may also partially account for China's pragmatic approach to international affairs. The position of Chinese regimes on international issues can change rapidly or even dramatically according to their domestic concerns or strategy for legitimization. That's all I want to say for now, and I look forward to the follow-up discussion and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Huang. Maybe a few things to highlight too before we start to get to questions from your talk, especially for those of our students. We have a range, I think, in our audience that are familiar or less familiar with authoritarian rule and also just Southeast Asia as a region. And you remind us well that even in relatively authoritarian political societies, policy and values still matter, and what the people and what they support and don't support still do matter. And the people do support, do understand the effect of policy on their lives. They also understand how a regime does not support traditional values or those values that are held close to people in their daily lives. And so you give us a lot to think about, rightly in those areas and how that affects practically how the regime operates regionally and globally as well and geopolitically. So thank you. We want to thank our speakers, of course, for wonderful opening remarks. Why don't we'll open it up here to questions in both the chat discussion board, and also if somebody does want to use audio, you can raise your hand and I should be able to get you off mute and be able to use that as well. Hopefully we'll have some audience questions start up here. Why don't as people do, actually we have one here, so let me, maybe we can start with this. Rio asks here, dependency here, China and the U.S. And vice versa. Let's just a second here, let me go back up, got a few. How dependent are China and U.S. Are they on one another and vice versa? We've talked some about, especially in our earlier remarks, about regionalism and the effects of Southeast Asia regionally, but just going larger to U.S.-China relations, maybe we can sort of lay out a little bit of geopolitically, what the relations there are, what the dependence is. I don't know if anybody maybe wants to start with that question, maybe speak to that. Dr. Cho?
I mean, just very briefly address the dependency question, but it's a little bit difficult to say which country is more dependent on each other, on the other, because of the various ways in which we can think about dependency. But certainly, I do think it's important to just realize that the United States and China they do depend on each other to a great extent, and that this dependency is a distinguishing kind of characteristic when you think about the relationship between these two countries, especially when you compare it, and some people try to compare it to the Cold War era, right? So given these tensions between the United States and China, people have been having the discussion of whether this is looking like a Cold War. But I think the fact that these two countries depend on each other so much, economically and politically, gives us a very different starting point to have the discussion.
If I might also add to that, thank you, Dr. Cho, for starting us off. I think as some of you may remember, there has been, and there actually still remains, I think, a lot of discussion about decoupling, right? And decoupling is basically the argument that the United States needs to extricate itself from this dependence on China, right? I mean, in very simplistic terms. But the point is that it's very difficult to do. It's actually very difficult to do. It's difficult on both sides to do, which is why it hasn't happened. It's difficult from a commercial sense, from a private sense, as well as from a government to government sense. And I think that China certainly is also very concerned about this because it is dependent on the United States for all sorts of things. I'll leave it at that. There's more we can say about that, but I think Dr. Cho's point is something that we all have to kind of keep in mind.
Excellent. We've had a lot of questions come in here too since we started answering this first one. So let me try to go to one of the other ones here. There are a couple questions addressing sort of levels of development in China compared to the United States, and one of these has to also do with the nuclear weapon discussion as a matter of security as well. I don't know if Dr. Cho or just any of you, of course, can speak to this. What explains the difference between China's relatively lower amount of nuclear weapons? The U.S. and Russia, much of that has to do with the Cold War era, of course, and Russia having that relatively large stockpile. But maybe we could speak to just China's nuclear arsenal, if anybody can, and just why it is somewhat high, but relatively lower than, say, the United States and Russia. Thomas.
Yeah, so certainly China has had a relatively small nuclear stockpile since the beginning, right? It never really had a plan to develop that many nuclear weapons. Now, one reason why the United States ended up having so many nuclear weapons is because of the Cold War and the arms race dynamic with the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviet Union and the United States even had arms agreements to reduce this kind of abundance in nuclear weapons. But the Chinese have a very different strategy to use their nuclear weapons, and this strategy differs drastically from the United States, for instance. So the Chinese have stated publicly that they will never use nuclear weapons first in a conflict, right? And different people have different views on to what extent this might be true, but nevertheless, the point is the Chinese seem to believe that they have a different strategy, and they rely on nuclear deterrence, which doesn't really require that many nuclear weapons. Some people refer to this as kind of minimum deterrence or kind of or assured destruction. But there are various different ways in which people have expressed this. Nevertheless, the point is that despite China's economy growing, China has not really felt a need to expand its nuclear weapons because it has a strategy which only requires a small number of nuclear weapons, and they so far seem to feel fairly secure about that strategy.
And there's a lot of other mechanisms here too, right? There's the marine, the maritime expansion, as you talked about, Dr. Cho, and these other sort of expansionary measures that do, it doesn't necessarily take nuclear weapons. There are many other tools in the toolbox as far as projecting power, these sorts of things geopolitically, I suppose. Let me sort of throw in a question too, and then maybe we can get back to a couple other student questions, sort of just trying to make it consistent and related to the first couple inquiries. We started off, Dr. Ba talking about, especially Southeast Asia and the region, and others did too. When we look at trying to prevent the worst scenarios of China, how much power do the Southeast Asian nations really have in this sense? A lot of people, especially those not, and our students too, that are maybe not, a lot read in Southeast Asia, oftentimes we stereotypically think of this as a U.S. China thing, right? That it's the two big powers and they're negotiating, and we don't oftentimes think of the smaller nations, in the neighborhood. How much power do they really have in this sense? And maybe you can sort of go over again some of the major tools that they have to be able to, again, sort of prevent larger expansion of China, or is that even what some of the other Southeast Asian nations want? So I can throw that out maybe as an additional question here.
I'll start. I'll say two things. I think the first thing is to understand that Southeast Asian interests are actually tipped towards the economics, right? And that actually helps to explain quite a lot in terms of how they respond to China. It's economic and it's domestic, right? And so whereas I think things like military projection tend to consume our headlines, the things that really animate much of Southeast Asian foreign policy, and again, this is a group of 10 states that vary, okay, so there are going to be differences amongst them, but economics and domestic regime legitimacy matters quite a lot. right? So just as, Professor Wang had talked about performance legitimacy in China, similarly, we can also say the same thing in Southeast Asia. That's number one. The second thing, which is your first question, the first part of your question, is that I think it is important to understand that Southeast Asian states actually do not believe in the Hobbesian maxim, right? Which is that the big powers do what they will and the small powers what they must, right? And so Southeast Asian states have actually played quite a proactive role in trying to complicate the strategic environment. That's probably the best way to kind of think about what their strategy is. And the way that they've complicated that strategic environment is to bring in a range of actors, right? If you look at some of the patterns by which they engage China and the United States, there's a really interesting choreography that's going on here in terms of engaging and balancing both relationships. We see this actually also even in terms of some military exercises, even though the United States, as Dr. Cho reminds us, is overwhelmingly unrivaled, right, in Asia. But these kinds of exchanges, I think, say something about both China's approach as well as Southeast Asian states' approach, right? But mostly they brought in all these different actors, for example, through those multilateral platforms that I suggested earlier, right? They've regularized participation from a range of different powers that are not insignificant, again, as our previous speakers highlighted. Australia is not an insignificant actor, right? I mean, Japan is not an insignificant actor. Korea has its influence as well in some different ways, right? So these are all part of Southeast Asian states' strategies. And I would argue that this applies across the board, across the 10 states, even though they have varying capacities to do it. So I would leave it at that.
It's a wonderful, reminder that we need to look at our world as a multilateral world, right? In the big picture sense. And regardless of where you are, that is the case. It's also we haven't even discussed the North Korea problem, of course, which is obviously a whole other major issue. But we have to remind ourselves these are major players as well, despite the two largest economies, U.S. and China, and we certainly need to recognize the self-interest and the power that the nations in the region hold as well, and those sorts of issues. Let me go back to a student question here, if you don't mind, unless others want to jump in. Paulette here asks, with China close in geography to many of the, obviously, the Southeast Asian countries, what are China's, maybe she's referring here also to the Chinese population too, this which could bring in Dr. Huang a bit maybe, general feelings about immigration both in and out of China. How does nationalism, both in the regime sense perhaps and in the population's sense of nationalism, influence this? So maybe we could talk about the immigration effect here a little bit, and maybe also on the Chinese population's experience and understanding of that as an issue towards the feelings of legitimacy towards the regime.
Yes, I want to maybe put on the table two interesting facts. One recent article finds that it's based on public survey data, finds that the young generation in mainland China, they are more authoritarian than the older generations. So this is very, and might be surprising to many people, because they thought that, well, according to the modernization theory, the young generations might have higher demand for, say, like freedom, right, political rights. But that's not the case, at least based on the public opinion data, the social survey data. So, and this carries some, I think, important implications for the social foundations of the legitimacy, the political legitimacy of the regime. And the second piece of like fact or phenomena I want to put on the table for discussion is about the heterogeneity among public opinions among people in their regime support. So the middle class, or even the upper middle class, or the higher income groups, they are more supportive of the current regime than the other classes. This, again, contradictory to the modernization theory. We think that after decades of economic growth, economic development, civil society organization will also develop, and which will lead to, again, maybe some driving force for democratization. But that's also not empirically supported based on the data from China. And there are a lot of other studies try to explain why the middle class, the higher income groups, they are stronger supporters of the regime. And many of those middle class, they are civil servants, they are state employees. They have very high stake in the stability, the maintenance of the current regime. And also the states, the regime use a lot of information control, propaganda, censorship to try to shape public opinion and the public discourse. So yeah, maybe these two pieces finding, I think it's very interesting, and also might stimulate follow-up discussion about nationalism and the sustainability of the performance legitimacy nationalism in China.
It is important to remember, regardless of the nation, middle class, upper middle class can be supportive of a regime if it also promotes stability and things like that. And I'm not sure if that's the case here in China, but speaking to that support that you talk about, Dr. Huang, it's maybe a little disappointing to hear the younger generation being more authoritarian than maybe a previous or preceding generations. But it is something that we'll need to think about as well in our students too. And I also say here as I continue, maybe a couple more questions from the chat. If any of you see any in the chat that you want to specifically address as well, of course we welcome that. There's another question here, Jocelyn. What are some? Now I know Dr. Cho explicitly talked about this earlier. That it's maybe hard to get to what the actual values of the regime, or what the intentions, I should say, of the regime are, right? Maybe we could speak to that a little bit more, try to parse that out a little bit. Jocelyn's asking about that here. What are some of the most important values that China believes would bring them more power overall in the world? Or is that even one of the main driving forces here? We can stereotypically think about geopolitics as a striving for power, but is it possible to maybe parse that out a little bit, any of you, including Dr. Cho, about what is driving the Chinese regime here? This goes back to that thing of grand strategy that Dr. Goldstein and I talked about this time last year. Maybe that's the way to sort of frame this question, the sort of grand strategy. What is that, and can we know that?
Great. So this is a big topic in and of itself, but just to add a few points here, I think having quickly mentioning the kind of historical background here might be important as well. So sometimes people refer to the century of humiliation that China had. So going back to the Opium Wars, for instance, and before that, China was a very influential, was the largest power in the Asian region. And after the Opium Wars, the Chinese regard this as a century of humiliation, where the empire eventually crumbled, and Western powers had a lot of influence over different parts of China, for instance, in Hong Kong, for instance, right? So we're thinking about China's grand strategy. People often link this idea back to China kind of having its place in the sun again, right? More kind of neutrally, we might say that China wants to become regarded as a more influential and global player. So we think about this role of status in the world, right? So how much status does China have in the world? How much respect does it earn in the world? And these are kind of values that are linked but not identical to having a larger economy or necessarily having a more powerful military, right? And these are things that I think become much more subtle, right? So how do you actually achieve status and recognition and be regarded as a responsible kind of power in the world, in addition to having a larger economy and in addition to having a more capable and modernized military? So I think these are some things that are involved in what China eventually wants to achieve.
Maybe just last two things here. First of all, I think it's important for our students to know about, again, we oftentimes obviously think of U.S. China relations here, and sort of going along with the theme of some of the previous and future events that we're going to have in this series. what is the, if you could sort of, if you could tell the American population, the American people, some advice on how to think about China and U.S. China relations in sort of a big picture sense. And maybe this could speak to all of you. Dr. Barr with your emphasis on regionalism, Dr. Cho, your emphasis on sort of some of the military and other those sort of potentially conflictual things, and Dr. Huang with your focus on how Chinese people and the Chinese population think about the regime and how that affects their actions geopolitically. What are some ways that the American people should think about China? Because if we look at the general U.S. population, obviously there are understandings and misunderstandings, as there is with any nation. But it's also I think legitimate to say that recently, past 2-3 years, we've seen a rise both on the left and the right of seeing China now as sort of the main rival, right? It's kind of, I don't mean to say it bluntly, but kind of the enemy geopolitically, right? In terms of how the American population thinks about those things. How would you advise, if you had a chance to say, maybe briefly to our students as part of the broader U.S. population, how to think about Chinese-U.S. relations and China in general? How should we conceptualize it and think about it? Maybe that's an appropriate point to sort of start to wrap up and end on. Any of you can start if you'd like to. And if many of you or all of you could contribute to this, that would be wonderful.
Well, maybe I can begin and share some of my thoughts regarding that question. So I think you're exactly right that the discussion within the United States has become a little bit more hawkish than it used to be, and particularly the Democrats have become more kind of hawkish towards China in recent years. And that is I think, at least it feels like a big shift. I do want to also mention that the United States or US foreign policy has had this kind of pivot to Asia or rebalance to Asia, right? So this greater attention to Asia. And I think that is a good way to think about China and the Asian region, right? So more attention to it I think is certainly the right direction, but there's several things I think people should be careful about when thinking about China, at least 3 things. One is to mistake how powerful China is, especially in the military realm. This is something that I mentioned in my opening remarks. But sometimes people think China is extremely powerful militarily, that it somehow is going to compete militarily on a global scale with the United States. But I think that is not really in the cards in the foreseeable future. So I think understanding that power disparity, I think, is one important thing. The second thing is what was just mentioned, which is that sometimes people maybe mistakenly use this phrase, the enemy or the adversary, when mentioning and discussing China. I even see this in news reports, right? So I'm watching the TV and the reporters or the commentators sometimes use this term, right? Like how to deal with the adversary. And I think that's wrong, right? China is not an enemy in any sense, right? China is not at war with the United States currently. So I think using that term is mistaken, and thinking about adversarial relations and countries at war, I think is a very different thing, right? So you even have the Cold War, you have countries like South Korea and North Korea, which are still officially at war. So US-China relations, I think, are very different. Third thing I think to avoid is to think about the current US-China relations as somehow a Cold War II, right? So sometimes people use that phrase, and sometimes people think these increasing tensions looks like the Cold War. But again, as I mentioned earlier, that's something I think people should avoid. And the kind of follow-on to that is to think that the United States should try to contain China. I don't think that is the appropriate kind of strategy at this stage. Having said that, I do think that there isn't much room for complacency, that people should be vigilant, people should pay attention to US-China relations. I think that's very important. But at the same time, I don't think people should be kind of overly kind of alarmed, kind of hypersensitive, right? So maintaining a strong capability in terms of military capability, cyber capabilities, maintaining close relationships with allies, I think these are the right kind of steps. And also, furthermore, cooperating with China, because there are many areas in which the United States and China needs to and should cooperate to address global issues such as climate change.
Dr. Ba, go ahead. Yes.
Yes, sorry, unless you wanted to. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, that was everything I had to say. Thank you.
I'll add to Dr. Cho's comments, and I'm going to echo some of them. I think that, ultimately both the United States and China are large powers. We can talk about we can debate how large they are, but they're large powers and they have global interests, right? And so inevitably there's going to be competition. And so I think that it's important for Americans, for the United States, to approach that relationship as having a range of things, right? There are going to be areas in which the two countries are competitive, but there are also areas in which they are highly interdependent. Actually, most areas, I would argue that they're highly interdependent. And so it requires both of them to cooperate, right? I mean, the most prominent example that we're all familiar with is actually climate change, but there are others that we can talk about. But in the end, there are areas in which both sides can work together. And I think it's really important not to frame it, to kind of echo Dr. Cho's earlier point. I think it's really important not to frame it as an ideological battle or a battle between different identities, because when you start to do that, then it's very difficult to cooperate even on the areas that we have significant reason to do so, right? And so I think that's really important to note. So I think I'll just leave it at that. There's probably more we could say, but I'll turn it over.
I echo what Dr. Cho and Dr. Barr have said, and I also agree that tensions over some issues don't necessarily mean that there is no possibility for cooperation on other issues. And one thing I want to add into this is that I agree the China-U.S. rivalry is very important. It's a key determinant of global affairs, international relations, but it is not all. It's not everything. The recognition of the rise of China, the China challenge, should be matched with consideration of the collective responses and also maybe some counteracting measures towards China's increasing assertiveness and ambitions. For example, we know that nowadays the public opinions in China's neighboring countries about China has more moving towards the negative side. For example, the South Korean majority of them think negatively about China, and those elements will also play in and also might play a role in determining international relations, not just about China, not just about the China-U.S. rivalry.
These are very precise responses. As we sort of close down and sort of off this last question or set of questions here, I hope all of our audience here and our students that you've given us, a lot to sort of, I think a lot of starting points and beyond that to sort of think about in the region and with U.S.-China relations. The importance of the surrounding countries, the negotiative bodies that encompass that, the various national interests of within the region and also of China, and sometimes how it can be a little difficult to understand China's intentions, based on some of those actions, and also about the importance of regime support here and what internally is happening within the country, and how the Chinese population is both in one way stable but also in one way changing. And what the future can hold with those sorts of things, as each of you have talked about, I think, respectively, as guests here this afternoon, this evening. I don't know if there are any other closing remarks or not. I think we've covered, and we're probably almost at time for our event here. We've covered a decent amount of the student questions. Got some moderated questions in as well. I think we've covered a lot of ground. And I hope this gives, again, a good set of starting points and beyond for our students to continue to discuss these issues as we continue with a lot of themes on China's role in the world and how this affects things both regionally and globally, geopolitically, and security as well. If no other comments, thank you, Alice Huang and Xian, for being here. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure having you at Rowan College of Burlington County, our virtual campus. I'll be in touch with you quickly afterwards in the coming week or so to sort of wind this down. And thanks to all of you for joining us on the RCBC Global Studies Lecture Series. We will see you all next time.